Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and this week I made Bowser. Now when it comes to making a big burly fire-breathing tortoise, there are four main bone-building ingredients: wire, thicker wire, electrical wire, and gut bulking aluminum foil, and a big block of wood to mount it all on. I'm slowly but surely learning that the importance of leg day isn't only relegated to gym bros, since in the past I've built some pretty top-heavy models using wimpy armature wire, and before the end I've had to remake the legs a dozen times since the sad, soft wire wobbles and bends, leaving me with broken legs and missing toes. In an effort to curb that problem, I've started using exceptionally thick, heavy gauge armature wire to at least make the bottom portion of my model, and the difference is immeasurable. Well, I mean, it's totally measurable in that my legs don't snap off nearly as often, but hyperbole is the single greatest thing ever. Otherwise, once I've got my exceptionally beefy metal leg bones bent and in place, I'll make some much wimpier arm armatures, then pull my Bowser bones out of the mount so as I can add some wiring. Now, I don't normally condone putting standard electrical wire in the oven, but this particular stuff is silicone sheathed and rated to 200 degrees Celsius, which is significantly hotter than my oven gets when I'm baking my clay. What this means is that I can hide the wire within the armature before I even get to adding my sculpture on top, so the end result is seemingly wireless. Then, with the wire wound around and up the body, I can remount my bones on the block and start to bulk up the body with aluminum foil. I like to build any of these bigger bodies with a thick base of aluminum since it reduces the weight and cost of the model, so I don't need to use nearly as much clay. It also helps to ensure the clay evenly cures and significantly reduces cracks and bubbles as it's baking. Finally, I'll wrap the waist with a bit of wire to support Bowser's tail, then it's time to start smooshing clay on top. Bowser's got a nice yellow base coloring, and yellow is a notoriously obnoxious color to paint since it takes, on average, about 1 million coats to get a nice even coverage. To that end, to save myself a little heartache when it comes time to paint, I'm gonna build the majority of his body out of this delightful mustard yellow colored clay. My thinking is that the painting yellow over yellow should be pretty easy, so the initial base color doesn't matter too much, and when it comes time to painting the green sections, green's generally a much more opaque paint, so any of the other sections should be easy to paint over top of. It does, however, mean that for the rest of the video, my fingers look like I smoke 10 packs a day or I have a severe case of jaundice, so I'm sorry for that. Normally I make my bodies first, then add the arms after the whole thing's been baked, but this yellow color has me feeling pretty audacious, so I'll bulk up the little arm wires, then get to covering them in their own layer of clay. To make Bowser's feet, I'll smoosh a little blob of clay onto his bottom stumps, then blend them in to make some very short shoes, which I can then cut a triplet of toes into and poke and prod until they're a bit more toe looking. Finally, to fit his toe talons in place, I'll poke each of the toes with a little ball stylus before getting to work making my toenails. Making toe talons is as easy as rolling a little ball of clay into a sharp egg shape that would be painful to pass, then repeating this process until you've got the full set. Then with these little toe daggers done, it's just a case of sticking them into the stumps and adding some final toe wrinkles and foot folds as needed. To make Bowser's impressive six-pack abs, I'll mark out where I want the edges to line up along the center of his belly and underside, then I can come back with a series of sculpting tools to delineate each extra long abdominal muscle, then scoop the clay back and forth until I've got a body that would make Mr. Olympus proud. And once everything's been smoothed and all the harsh lines have been softened, I can start to add the scaly texture using my much beloved Tryptophobia texturizers. I'll start by going over the majority of the body with the smaller of the rollers to give my muscly mustard yellow shellless tortoise an initial scaly appearance before using the larger of the rollers to create the bigger scales on his shoulders and around his back. Finally, before I give his body an initial bake to save my progress, I'll poke some divots into his tail so I can fit some little tail spikes in place. Then it's into the oven to cure so I can get to work making his head. I'll start by wrapping the exposed wire with a thick, flat worm of clay to make the extra chunky neck, then I can start making his head by creating his bottom jaw first and pressing it into place. I'll say this now before my comment section is flooded with comments letting me know that I made his head too big. I am aware. My plan was to make the movie version, but I got carried away and ended up making an amalgamation of the two with the overall shape and coloring of the movie Bowser, but with like a massive head. Which is fine, I think, since the video game version of Bowser tends to have a head that's roughly the size of a small car. Besides, I've got a massively oversized head, and apart from a wonky center of gravity and an inability to find hats that fit me, I'm doing alright. Otherwise, I can stick Bowser's nose balls in place, then add his actual nose on top, followed by the larger portion of his cranium. I'll then blend this into the neck, then I can take a bit of time to smooth everything out and add the lumps and bumps where I think the lumps and bumps are supposed to go. To make his eyes, I'll poke some big old eyeball divots into the sides of his head, then fit a couple flat coins of white clay inside before building up the upper and lower lids to make him look appropriately angry. Some final shaping of his brain box and some last smoothing and blending, then I can stick some pre-baked horns in place into the sides of his head and blend them in with a couple wormy dealies wrapped around the base. I'll then poke a couple sniffing holes into the front of his face, add some final scaly texture on top, then get to work giving him some great big hands. These start out as oversized blobs of clay smooshed onto his empty arm nubs, upon which I will jam some thick sausages of clay and blend them in. I'll then poke some more of those nail divots into the tips and fill each finger with its own matching fingernail. Finally, some finger wrinkles and final smoothing and positioning, and it's into the oven to bake again before getting to work adding his leather daddy straps. I've rolled out some thick wormy dealies of black clay, then rolled them flat in my pasta machine so I can wrap them around his wrist and biceps. I'll then smoosh them flat with the flat of my smooshing tool, then gently tap them with a ball stylus to give them a nice hammered iron texture before poking little divots for future spikes. Otherwise, that's the body finished and it's time to make a shell. I've got the general shape of a shell made out of a layer of aluminium that I'll then wrap in an initial layer of gray clay, then wrap in a top coat of mustard yellow clay. I did this because I'm running out of yellow clay, which is unfortunate because I need it for Bowser, but it's also fortunate because the color is starting to make my eyes bleed. The shell then gets an extra long, extra wormy white wormy dealie wrapped around the circumference, and I can press it onto Bowser's back. Using the flat tip of my cheese knife turned clay cutting tool, I can start to mark out the initial design of his turtle shell hexagon pattern before coming back with my spatula tool to round out the edges and make it look a little more natural. I'll then give it a quick smoothing with my silicone shaper, then wrap the entire shell in cling film so that I can roll some spirals into each of the hexagons. The cling film helps to make sure the ball stylus leaves soft, flat cuts in the clay rather than leaving deep, unsightly imprints. I'll then poke some spike divots into the center of the patterns so I can fit a set of oversized pre-baked spikes in place. These then get wrapped in their own little wormy dealies to blend them in, and I can finally add the little black spikes to my arm straps. To keep the painting fuss to a minimum, I'll fill Bowser's mouth with a layer of fleshy pink clay, then I can give him some slightly darker pink gums, which I can then sink a set of pre-baked teeth into. Finally, I can stick a tongue in place underneath the wiring. All that's left to do then is pull his shell off so I can add his spiky choker that I totally didn't forget about until just now. Last but not least, a couple little worms of reddish orange clay will be his eyebrows, and I can build up his fiery red mohawk in sections, and that's the sculpting finally finished, which means I can finally start to cover up this truly awful yellow color. With more yellow, obviously. However, I think this is a much less jarring yellow. Where the initial coloring was sort of a gross processed Heinz mustard, this yellow is a more fancy French brand Dijon mustard. A Grey Poupon, if you will. His shell, of course, will get a nice green base coat to cover up the yellow, and I'll use that same dark green to give the top half of his head a once-over as well. I'll then start to tickle the tops of his shoulders with the green, trying my best to blend the yellow into the green, only touching the tops of the scales, leaving the yellow underneath. Of course, this green's a bit harsh and flat, so I'll work my way through the green with a series of progressively lighter shades until I'm left with a nice gradient. I'm using a stiff bristled brush to do my blending since I want it to be sort of scratchy and rough rather than a nice smooth gradient, since Bowser's the battle-worn murder tortoise who's probably got a few scars to show for a life of kidnapping princesses. I'll tone the yellow down a bit with the same sort of process, adding some highlighting around his bulbous cheekbones, then I can paint his six-pack inline abs with a much lighter bone white so they stand out a bit more. I'll then give his back, spikes, and horns a base coating of gray, then follow that with a wet blending of white and bone white, and I can paint the black spike straps with a dark steel metallic top coat while the spikes themselves will get a slightly lighter steel covering. I'll then follow that up with a silver dry brush along the edge to make them look sorta scuffed up before giving Bowser's fingernails and toes a simple sepia wash. Back to the back, the connection points between the spikes and the shell will get an initial orangey blending into the green, followed by a bone white highlight along the edges. His horns will get a more pronounced orangey brown base coat, and the hair will get a once-over with a fiery red base coat, followed by a series of progressively lighter dry brushes to highlight the tips. I'll then give his teeth the toenail sepia wash, followed by a dirty white wet blending before moving on to painting his angry pupils. As always, the eyes get a coating of UV resin to give them a nice healthy shine, and then it's time to make some fire. And to make my fire, I'm gonna use this orange noodle. This is an Edison filament, and it's kinda awesome since it's super wobbly and flexible, but it still somehow produces a lovely warm light. Of course, it's not nearly long enough for my needs, so I'll solder a set of 3 of them together before soldering them into the wiring in Bowser's mouth. And assuming I didn't cock up the polarity, they should light up nicely using the exposed wiring at the bottom. This then leaves me with some lovely, albeit slightly impotent fire. Now I know this happens to a lot of guys, but to help my LEDs stand a little straighter, I'll connect a loop of armature wire to the length I left sticking out of Bowser's mouth so I can wrap the bulb around it. Some extra thin armature wire will help keep the filament stuck to the wiring, then I can give the entire thing a coat of tacky PVA glue so I can cover it in a thin layer of cotton balls. Finally, to make my cotton balls look a little bit more like fire, I'll give it a once over with a bright yellow before tickling the tips of the fire with a fiery orange. Then, once the battery's connected at the bottom, the lights should shine through, leaving me with a pretty impressive gout of fire, which means Bowser is done and it's time to make a base. Now, admittedly, I had a completely different plan for this particular Bowser, but due to time constraints and, well, poor planning, I had to cut this a little shorter and make Bowser a standalone model. With that in mind, I figured if he's going to be blasting a big gout of fire off into the nothingness, then I may as well lean into the Mario movie and make him standing on a snowy platform as if he's blasting the Snow Kingdom with his horrifying fiery breath. So once I painted the edges of my blue foam box black, I can start to add the snow. This is One Strike hole filler, and it's easily my favorite snow-making material for sculptures. I'll spread it onto the top of my base, then spread it around like a delicious life-ending icing before pressing Bowser into place. The hole filler will deform around his feet like snow, and as it dries, it'll hold him in place as well. Of course, Bowser was blasting his fire breath in self-defense after he was attacked mercilessly by the penguins, so to show that he's not the bad guy here, I'll make some tiny hole filler snowballs to scatter around Bowser's feet. A little hole filler pressed onto his shoulder and down his arm will show the extent of the attack as well. Then the only thing left to do is connect my wires to a battery pack, glue the battery pack to the underside of the base, and, well, that's us done and on to the glamour shots.
Do you yield?
I do not.
As always, a huge thank you to the incredible patrons of Patreon who continue to support the creation of tiny nerdy things, and a big old, hey, what's up, to my newest patrons, Mark MTG, Christopher Crandall, David, Saracen Rue, Morgan Bowery, Hatch, Bone Club, George JH, Zach Smith, Bree Snow, Kygro, Harrison Mays, Rebecca McDaniel, Blurring Vision, Melissa Fuller, McRae Alford, Ginger S, Pimpasaurus, and happy birthday, Kaylin! You are the extra thick aluminium armature that holds this big beefy murder tortoise in place. As always, do the thing and click the other thing and all that other stuff. But most importantly, remember to tip your server on the way out. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.